ultimate dream for many transhumanists is uploading. We shall define it in this video as transferring a mind to a computer hardware using whole brain emulation. The idea being that a good enough simulation of a human brain simultaneously gives a simulation of the human mind, and if the simulation is sufficiently detailed and accurate, it's not just a mere simulation, but an exact replica of the mind, an emulation. While mind uploading might seem to transhumanists to be the logical endpoint, two of today's largest and most prestigious ongoing research projects, the Human Brain Project by the European Union and the Brain Initiative by the White House, neither of these two has mind uploading or even a true brain simulation among its explicit goals. Transhumanists, however, despite the lack of scientific engagement, still try to, with certainty, claim when the science of mind uploading will be a reality. Kurzweil from 2005 states that the breakthrough will happen in the 2030s. However, very uncertain assumptions underline that prediction. Another paper by Sandberg and Bostrom from 2008 is a bit more realistic, as they go through a whole range of possible scenarios and breaks it down into what they consider the three main ingredients in whole brain emulation, namely scanning, translation, and simulation. Let's go through some of the fundamental problems in terms of if mind uploading is even technically possible. Scanning is the high-resolution microscopy needed to detect and register all the relevant details of the brain. While huge uncertainty remains as to the level of resolution needed for this, it seems likely that the necessary level has already been attained, since techniques for seeing individual atoms are becoming increasingly routine. Still, the speed and parallelization likely needed to avoid astronomical scanning times is not there yet. To highlight this problem, let's do some math. We can calculate the number of atoms in your brain if we know the mass and a constant called Avogadro's number. A typical human brain of an adult male weighs about 1,400 grams, so we end up with 1.4 times 10 raised to the 26 atoms. The simple truth is, we are nowhere close to mapping that many atoms in any software, and even with the impressive rate at which computing power increases, it's unlikely, to say the least, that the computing power needed to process that info will in any way develop within the near or the far future. In fact, it's possible no computer will ever be able to process such an amount. In the paper from 2008, it's focused mainly on techniques involving slicing the brain in thin slices that are scanned separately using one of the microscopy technologies that may be available. However, the obvious problem of this is that you can only do this to a person who is deceased. Hence, this can obviously not be used for mind uploading, but rather to merely get a baseline structure of a brain. To do scanning that isn't destructive is nigh impossible. A speculative suggestion, two papers from 2005 and 1999, suggests using nanobots that enter the brain and scan the microscopic structures. However, basic thermodynamics most likely prevents this idea, as overheating the brain before scanning is complete will be a major issue. For more on this type of issue, arising from implanting devices to do computing in the brain, see part 1 of this series, link in the description. Image analysis and other information processing, turning the scanned data into something that can be used as an initial state for the simulation, is called translation. The amount needed seems to be huge. Reading from the paper of 2008, cell membranes must be traced, synapses identified, neuron volumes segmented, distribution of synapses, organelles, cell types, and other anatomical details, blood vessels, glia cells, identified. Again, the sheer computing power needed might very well be insurmountable. Simulation requires large amounts of hardware capability in terms of memory, bandwidth, and CPU, presumably in a massively parallel architecture. Exactly how large these amounts need to be depends, of course, on the level of microscopic detail required for a satisfactory emulation. It may also depend on the amount of understanding we have of the higher level workings of the brain. The less we have of that, the more critical it is to get the microscopic details exactly right, requiring more computing power. However, all of this is just the first problem of many to overcome. The second problem is to transfer the information to the computer and preventing information loss, which frankly is impossible. So thank you for doing this interview. Now tell us a little about yourself and why people should care about your opinion on this and what you're going to talk about specifically.
Yeah, so I work in medical research right now. I got a PhD in genetics 2 years ago, but I don't just look at genetics because I look at the functional component of it. And as a result, you have to look at a myriad of things like immunology, hormone levels, as well as actual mechanical physiological effects too, because all of these affect gene expression. And one of the things that we discussed actually quite a bit for a full semester even, along with other things, was the effects of implants, not just neurological implants, but implants in general, and why the body just does not get along well with a lot of things that we put in ourselves that are synthetic in nature.
Basically, the reason I wanted your opinion on this is because we're talking about mind uploading, the idea that you can upload a human mind, if you will, to a computer, that you can map a human brain, and you can basically emulate the entire thing, and basically one day you will wake up in a computer and you will live forever in that sense. I mean, let's disregard obvious flaws in this, like eventually that computer is going to shut down at some point and you will die anyway. There's also a problem just from the get-go, as I explained earlier in this video. Just basically transferring your consciousness in the first place to a computer is going to be a huge challenge, and not really possible in the sense that, you know, transhumanists would usually believe. Tell us a little about this. Why wouldn't it work the way they think?
Well, you have a whole host of problems just with neurological interfaces that are supposed to help with basic functions, not even upload your consciousness, much less. Like, take, for example, something that, you know, we all heard about at some point or another, maybe even know someone who's got one, which is a cochlear implant. And we've had those around forever. I don't know exactly how long they've been FDA approved here stateside, but I know we've had them at least since the 90s. But when you remove a cochlear implant from someone who's had them in for a long time, it looks like it's been burned by acid, because the silicone coating that's on there has undergone oxidative reduction reactions from your immune cells, because they recognize that silicone shit in there is not supposed to be there. It's the same if you want to go on a more crude level. You think about boob implants, right? The silicone, you got to get them changed out every decade or something like that, because, you know, your immune system's just going to say, all right, this is just not okay. They're going to eat through that coating layer on them, and it's not pretty when that happens. So when you look at things like the brain, for example, because if we're going to talk about, you know, uploading your consciousness, that's primarily going to be the focus there. When you have your higher thought functions, which resort a lot in your cortical tissues, and, you know, not just the frontal lobe, but just having something stuck in there physically causes pro-inflammatory molecules to get pumped out at the site of injury. They call them cytokines. And these cytokines cause inflammation, and they draw in white blood cells. It also causes cytotoxic reactions to occur that will actually start degrading the actual neuronal clusters that are around the site of entry point with that neural interface. So most of the time you lose about half the damn neurons that are right by your implant, where the contacts are supposed to be. And for a long time, we've been using silicone-based electrodes back in like the 60s and the 70s and shit like that. But we found out real quickly that, yeah, you're going to cause toxic reactions within those small areas. And even the blood-brain barrier starts to open up to recruit more white blood cells, and macrophages and microglia in particular are going to go in there and really start cleaning house around that area. So you have fewer and fewer neurons to even interact with. And so that in and of itself causes one hell of a problem for implants to be able to record and transmit a signal properly. Just for, let's say you want to have somebody who's had optical nerve damage, right? And you want to help them see again. Well, they've done this in humans, and they've noticed that, you know, okay, the surface area of these electrodes, they call them Utah style electrodes. And don't ask me why. I don't remember the exact reasoning why. I'm guessing somewhere in Utah they built these in the beginning, but they have good surface areas, so they allow a lot of signal transduction to occur. But the problem is you get corrosion from the immune system. And this even happens when you're dealing with gold-plated tungsten interfaces. And you'd think that gold, which is real resilient against oxidation and things like that, you wouldn't have this kind of problem, but it will, in fact, degrade, usually within a couple of months. And so it's not good to have to go into somebody's brain and pull out an old chip and put a new one in. And well, we've had better success with things like platinum, but again, as you no doubt know, platinum's kind of hard to come by and really expensive. And so as you have these, what they call a complement immune system reaction occur, the extracellular matrix as well starts creating substances that inhibit signal transduction. And you get like the equivalent of scar tissue buildup around that area. And another thing that we learned about was that, let's say you've got like a silicon-based electrode. It's like a little pin or something like that, right? And it's inside your brain. Your brain moves when you move. It sloshes around in your skull. And there's a lot of elasticity to it because it's, a lot of fat makes up your brain. And so when you have this stiff electrode stuck inside your cortical tissue, it doesn't move or bend with all the other cells and tissue surrounding it. So it causes mechanical damage too every time you move too much. And so that causes even more inflammation to occur. So just looking at it from a basic neuroinflammation kind of point of view, human evolution has put a lot of resources into creating and protecting your brain. And your immune system in particular is very defensive of it. So just trying to use a neuro interface directly into the central nervous system, it's kind of a shit show with dealing with the immune system reactions. Although we have made some progress with it, but the genetic component of it gets bad too, because if you know about epigenetics, you know that your genetic distribution of what's being expressed changes depending on what's going on inside your body.
Right,
and
yeah.
You get TNF alpha and pro-inflammatory cytokine genes. They get upregulated when you have an injury inside your brain, even though you'd say, okay, what if it's a really tiny implant, right? Or even it's almost microscopic because of, electronics just gets so advanced, right? 'Cause things get smaller and smaller and smaller. But you still have to physically cut through the skull. Or maybe if you're going to be even more clever, you could go through the nasal cavity and insert it up there like the Egyptians used to do when they used to scramble people's brains and stuff like that. But still, you're having to cut into the tissue. And on a cellular level, your body's going to notice that. So these pro-inflammatory genes get upregulated as well. And when that happens, you have spliceosomes that will also go in there, and they will edit what's being transcribed to cause promotion editors to come up with those same genes and cause them to upregulate even more, because the source of the stimulus has not gone away, because it's the implant still there. And so it just kind of cascades going downhill, and the snowball gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then you just get corrosion of the interface materials. And so that in and of itself is just kind of a shit show right now.
That's just looking from it from a immunoresponsive perspective, of course. Then you have another problem on top of this. Maybe you feel inclined to go into that as well, and it's the fact that let's say that someone is trying to read someone's brain waves, outside of the skull. That has difficulties in of itself. And as you just explained, you will have a lot of difficulties reading the actual brain if you go into the actual brain itself to get a better signal, if you will, just from the immunoresponsive perspective. But then we also have the fact that the brain works in a fundamentally different way from a computer. The way your brain sends signals, even within itself, is fundamentally different from how a computer does it. And the problem is you would have to convert a message from the brain so a computer would understand it, right? Now,
right, you got... Oh, go ahead.
No, it's just, what I'm wondering is, it's pretty clear that you can't read a brain, even if you somehow introduced electrodes, straight into the brain to read its signals. It's pretty clear just thinking about this that you're never going to be able to read the brain 100% correct. So how even if we disregard the fact that your immune system is going to go haywire and quickly erode these electrodes, how much of the signal do you think is actually going to be preserved in the when you convert it from the brain signal to a signal that the computer will actually understand to store the data of your brain? How much of that do you think is going to be how much fidelity do you think there is?
That's going to be tough, because just that you got to understand that the physics of where you place the electrode contacts in relation to the synaptic gap of the axon ends. You got to be within 50 to 150 microns if you're going to get a good signal.
Right.
And that's a very small margin for error for physically implanting something.
Mm-hmm.
And let's say that you're dealing with, like we call them ensembles. These are like clusters of neurons that work together for a certain type of signal transduction. And, we can talk about like how they've done it to the rhesus monkeys, where they've had electrodes in their brains and the monkey can move the cursor on the screen to like a little game they play, like kind of like Pong almost. And he can do it without moving his hand anymore. But you are correct that the nuance of how he moves the cursor on the screen is not as good as when he's doing it with his hand.
Mm-hmm.
So there is some signal degradation, because analog is what you're dealing with when you're dealing with the brain. The computer's working digital.
Yes.
And so because of the analog nature of brain, there's a lot of nuance in a signal, because you don't just move like a robot. When you're walking, you can move fast, you can move slow, you can move somewhere in between, you can twist, you can turn, you can shake, you can be still, like, et cetera, et cetera. There's a whole spectrum of possibilities just in motor functions alone. And that's not even going into the miasma of higher thought processes when you're trying to contemplate something. And because of that, it's hard to look at the actual peaks and dips when you're looking at these signal variances and to try to get a 100% conversion rate, not just because of the physical relationship between the actual connector and the synaptic gap of the axons that you're trying to get in close to, because you want to have a certain level of surface area, because a single neuron is not going to really cut it really if you're trying to transfer a signal across, let's say, a damaged spinal cord. You need to get a cluster or an ensemble of them to give you an adequate signal. We're not good enough with what we have to do just one neuron to the next.
Right.
And so that alone is proof that you're not going to have 100% transference of the signal. And you have to understand that the way the electrodes work is they have to have insulator coatings on them. So again, so you don't have instantaneous initiation of corrosion on it. They can use silicon carbide, which is way better than what they used to use. And they used to use boron. I was just like, oh man.
Boron of all things.
Yeah, it's not going to be a little toxic there, especially in your brain. It's like, okay, buddy. Let's see those poor monkeys. Those poor monkeys.
Wow.
Anyway, hey, it was the 70s, man. Anyway, the whole point, though, is that you're going to have to struggle with the physical distances to make sure that they're optimal. Kind of like with a computer, how the transistors have to be a specific distance from one another, and they have to stay there in order for your CPU to function properly. And then there's the fact that those signals in them, there's going to be so many different values. It's not going to be like 0 and 1. You're going to have a whole variances of signals in between those two ends of the spectrum, which I don't think is going to be too difficult conceptually. It's just that, again, getting all of it across is going to be it's iffy, and that's with massive improvements over what it was before.
Exactly, and the problem is, however, that the whole idea of mind uploading is that even if you, again, let's disregard all the other problems. Let's say that we have cracked it. Let's say that it is. Let's say it turns out that it is 100% physically possible to transfer your consciousness to a computer. Even then, we still have the problem that not all of you you as in the way you experience the world, you as an individual, your ego, not all of you will be transferred. And that's a problem.
Well, yeah, it gets even worse than that because of the fact that there's a physical component to the aspect of memory, long-term memory, because we have dendritic spines, which are critical towards forming memories.
Yes.
And those dendritic spines kind of act like, how to put it? I guess the closest metaphor I could come up with would be like how CDs used to be read with the little bumps on the CD disc.
Right.
And those bumps convey certain data. And those spines form in different relations to the distance from the nucleus of the neuron, and they're on the dendrites. And so the more surface area you've got, the more connectivity you get. The more connectivity you get in general, though not always, the higher the cognitive performance. And so you're not going to transfer those dendritic spines over via electronic upload. It's just not going to happen.
Uh-huh. So yeah, that's another thing that is a big problem. I didn't even think about that, to be honest. But that's, now that you mention it, that is a huge flaw. I mean, another flaw, let's say, because trust me, there's a lot of flaws with this whole idea. So yeah, no, it's so even if we assume that we can transfer consciousness, and let's say that the parts that we transfer are indeed your actual consciousness, the problem is still it's not going to be all of your consciousness, and in that sense, technically speaking, it's not even going to be you, really, is it? Because let's say that we can transmit 90% of your consciousness to a computer. The problem is, how do we know that those 10% missing isn't what made you really you compared to most other individuals, or even what makes you even human, let's say?
Right.
What's to say that the 90% we transferred isn't just basically what allows you to be, an animal in your psyche? Maybe that remaining 10% was really what made you a human being even, Right. So what you would have is essentially a primate, in a computer, which would be
proto caveman.
Exactly. It would be a very horrible fate as well, because you would have the exact same situation as when speaking of the 70s, I think this was done in the 70s. There was actually an experiment done where they wanted to see how long they could keep a monkey brain alive outside of the body. And I don't know if you know of this experiment, but basically,
that sounds like something Stanford would have done back in the 70s. So I don't know if it was them, but.
Yeah, so basically what they did was, I think it was a rhesus monkey, or maybe, it was probably a rhesus monkey. And basically what they did was they managed to keep his brain alive for at least 12 hours or something outside of a body. But basically this brain had been severed, from the body. And they kept it alive with, a machine to pump the blood and whatnot, and oxygenate it and everything. And they managed to keep it alive for like 12 hours or something. But basically, can you imagine that monkey, essentially, just how horrible it must be? You have the consciousness, because they tested the brain, and it had the same brain waves as when the monkey would be awake. So basically this brain is awake, but it has absolutely no body, no senses whatsoever with the outside world. Can you imagine how scary that is?
Yeah, that sounds like when they talk about sensory deprivation chambers, but on another level entirely.
Yeah, not the good kind. This isn't the kind where, if you feel like it's getting a bit too trippy, you can just, open the lid. This is like you're literally a hostage. So it would be very much that situation too, if you manage to do this and you don't transmit everything, let's say. Then also there's another problem, of course, and this is what I discussed with Sinope later on. And it's how exactly do you okay, let's say that you transferred this to the computer, and now it's a software, let's say. So your consciousness is now a software. How the hell do you program anything to interact with this software exactly? It's because when you put on a VR headset, you experience this digital world through your senses of your body. You know, so basically what we're doing is it's kind of a biohacking, if you will. So we basically fool your senses, but it's still your senses from your brain.
Yeah.
But if you become a program yourself, well, you know, you're how exactly would you be able to experience anything in a virtual world the way you would experience, you know, the Matrix, let's say? Because you would be ones and zeros now. You wouldn't actually have any physical eyes, you wouldn't have any physical ears, you wouldn't have any physical skin to feel anything, you know?
Right, and it kind of goes into the whole aspect of the analog existence of what we convey as consciousness, and in a lot of ways, it sounds like you would have to be lobotomized in a way to experience anything. And even then, you know, I can't even begin to speculate what that would experience would be like, but I can't imagine it would be anything even close to life.
No, no, exactly. And yeah, it's like I told you. The more you think about this stuff, the more problems you run into when it comes to this. And I'm sure there's going to be some people who are going to be foolish enough to try, some willing guinea pigs. But to them, I just say Godspeed. You know, if he truly does exist, because God knows you're going to need it.
Yeah, I agree, because I mean, it's an interesting concept, I think, that we talk about, but with computers, right, in order for software to have a functionality, it has to have corresponding hardware to utilize it. And that's the component there that I think is being overlooked by a lot of these individuals who go into the transhumanist idea of uploading yourself into a robot or a computer or whatever you'd like to call it. We don't have hardware that simulates anywhere near the complexity of the human brain to house that consciousness. And so that's another thing that, to me, just it automatically sounds like a no-go, because you need to have the proper hardware to utilize software. I mean, because think about it in a much more simplified version that we bitch about all the time for those of us who play computer games.
Right.
We bitch about the APIs from DirectX 9 and 11 and 12 and how they just don't work worth the shit with a lot of games out there because they weren't coded properly for modern hardware.
Right.
And so that's just an example. When you have shit hardware, or sorry, shit software that doesn't correspond to the hardware, the vice versa can be true as well. And I think with a human consciousness, that's just going to be orders of magnitude more complex in nature in terms of developing the corresponding hardware to utilize that software properly. Because currently, like, that's the human brain, and it's the most complicated thing that we know of outside of trying to figure out the standard model, I guess.
The last point I wanted to go through is, okay, so you've gone through so far the different problems of just transmitting the signal in terms of the immune system, but also signals being lost on the way, which would be a problem because if you are going to transmit, you know, yourself, you want to transmit all of you. Or at least, you know, 99.99999% at least, which is probably not even feasible. But there's another problem, and you mentioned a little bit about this before, the dangers of it, like mechanical injury and whatnot. Like, let's say that someone tries to do this. How likely do you think it is that all that's going to happen is they're going to end up with permanent brain injury?
If I had to guess, just with current implants that we use, we're trying to use them to assist with basic functions like hearing and seeing and moving. And when we do implants in the actual cortical tissues, there is brain damage in the sense that it's localized to very small areas. But it's usually the kind of damage that, you know, it's not going to be fatal. It's not going to put you in any worse condition, at least not in the short term. It's just that your body doesn't like the fact that you just physically injured your brain on a small level. And I mean, think about when you get a concussion, how that affects you in terms of your memory and your ability to think straight.
Right.
And that's just from a concussion, banging your head around when you're playing football or some shit. Sticking something into your brain through the skull, you know, it's not going to be pretty over the long term, especially as your body tries to dispose of a foreign object. And mechanically speaking, when you move, your brain moves. And so, again, you have stiff components inside of a gelatinous brain. That's going to cause mechanical damage to the surrounding tissue. So that's a little nuance of what's wrong with this whole process as well. We need to make materials that are a bit more elastic, a bit softer, yet can still perform signal transduction properly. And yeah, that's just another issue that I see happening there. And as for transferring your consciousness, you'd have to get into not just the frontal cortex, as well as the parietal lobe and your hippocampus and the amygdala and all these really deep components.
Yeah, that's another problem, isn't it? Because it's not like the signal would be the same from just one part of your brain. Like, you would have to go from one part of the brain to the next to get a more complete image, wouldn't you?
Right, and you got to understand that we don't even fully understand the housing of long-term memory as it exists right now. That's a big mystery that we're dealing with. So let's say you're trying to capture the record of your life. Well, currently we wouldn't even know all the areas that we need to put those implants to do a transference, so I just don't, you don't even know where to plug it in. So what the hell do you do then? And so it's, I think we'll get there one day, but at least right now we're not there.
Mm-hmm. Well, anyway, I think that pretty much summarizes everything that you could contribute to this, and trust me, it was a lot. Just like Sinope, it was very interesting, and you really offered a lot to think about here, and even some stuff that I didn't even really think about, like the dendritic spine tissue
component there.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, yeah, thank you. You will find a link to Jones' Twitter in the description. He goes by Synthetic Dissident. Shortly before we end this, just tell people why they should follow you exactly.
Oh God, that's a great question. I don't even know.
Wow, great promo. Great promo.
Yeah, I mean, I don't really go on Twitter for meaningful interpretation of anything useful out there. I go there primarily to shitpost and just, watch other people make fools of themselves. Mostly to watch the Sean Spicier parody account. That's primarily why I go on.
Yes, kind of like me. People follow me on Twitter and they sort of expect, like, oh, he makes scientific videos. I'm sure that he posts, like, scientific stuff, and, he educates people on Twitter too. So I'm going to follow him on Twitter. And in reality, it's just me fucking retweeting stupid shit, or me responding to dumb shit, or just acting.
Twitter in general, I think, is just a shitty platform in general. I don't really care much for it. Let's be honest.
It really, like, it's a place run by bots. I mean, what do you expect? It's
social media. I get that it was a interesting theoretical, but the practical, not so much.
Yeah, it was supposed to be the best of humanity and technology. The problem is it's not even.
It brought out the worst and the best in terms of shitposting.
Exactly, but yeah. Anyway, thank you for this, and yeah. So far, we have covered the two problems of mind uploading. 1, the scanning process, and 2, the transference. But now we will discuss the third and final scientific problem. 3. Fundamental differences of function between hardware. Unlike the idea that many transhumanists have, as well as most people who are simply ignorant of technology and biology, the brain and a computer work in fundamentally different ways. To highlight these differences, I'll read from an article written for kids, explaining the differences. Yes, it really is this basic. Throughout history, people have compared the brain to different inventions. In the past, the brain has been said to be like a water clock and a telephone switchboard. These days, the favorite invention that the brain is compared to is a computer. Some people use this comparison to say that the computer is better than the brain. Some people say that the comparison shows that the brain is better than the computer. Perhaps it is best to say that the brain is better at doing some jobs, and the computer is better at doing other jobs. Let's see how the brain and the computer are similar and different. Both use electrical signals to send messages. The difference lies, however, in that the brain uses chemicals to transmit information. The computer uses electricity. Even though electrical signals travel at high speeds in the nervous system, they travel even faster through the wires in a computer. Both transmit information. A computer uses switches that are either on or off, binary. In a way, neurons in the brain are either on or off by either firing an action potential or not firing an action potential. However, neurons are more than just on or off because the excitability of a neuron is always changing. This is because a neuron is constantly getting information from other cells through synaptic contacts. Information traveling across a synapse does not always result in an actual potential. Rather, this information alters the chance that an action potential will be produced by raising or lowering the threshold of the neuron. Both can adapt and learn. However, it is much easier and faster for the brain to learn new things. Yet the computer can do many complex tasks at the same time, called multitasking, that are difficult for the brain. For example, try counting backwards and multiplying two numbers at the same time. Both can change and be modified. However, the brain is always changing and being modified. There is no off button for the brain. Even when an animal is sleeping, its brain is still active and working. The computer only changes when new hardware or software is added or something is saved in memory. There is an off button for a computer. When the power to a computer is turned off, signals are not transmitted. Both can do math and other logical tasks. The computer is faster at doing logical things and computations. However, the brain is better at interpreting the outside world and coming up with new ideas. The brain is capable of imagination. These differences are highlighted in even greater detail in a paper from 2017 called "Could a Neuroscientist Understand a Microprocessor?" Neuroscience is held back by the fact that it is hard to evaluate if a conclusion is correct. The complexity for the systems under study and their experimental inaccessibility make the assessment of algorithmic and data analytic techniques challenging at best. We thus argue for testing approaches using known artifacts, where the correct interpretation is known. Here we present a microprocessor platform as one of such test case. We find that many approaches in neuroscience, when used naively, fall short of producing a meaningful understanding. So to summarize to you, the audience, the brain works in a fundamentally different way from a computer. And as such, it is most likely impossible to emulate something like an emotion in a computer simulation. And emotions are a huge part of being a human being. If mind uploading ever does become a reality, you would not actually wake up as yourself in a computer, but rather as a representation of you. A cold, logical set of pure data void of any human emotion. Ironically, for a human's mind to be uploaded, one would have to be willing to give up what makes one human in the first place. Just listen to what this programmer had to say.
Well, okay. So something that you have to appreciate with programmers and people in computer science is that they find it to be almost impossible and also counterproductive to do things in precisely the way that they are expected to do them. There is usually a more efficient way of obtaining the goal, and the only thing that you're ever judged on is whether or not the ultimate users of whatever you produce are satisfied with what you made. So if you cheat by doing it in a different way or approximating what you're doing, then that is, from their perspective, as good most of the time as actually doing the thing. This is especially true in matters of quote artificial intelligence and also in artificial life. These issues get a little philosophical, you know. It comes into a definition of what does it mean to be conscious. The philosophers don't have very good answers for that sometimes. What does it mean to be alive? The biologists often have very unsatisfying answers if you're trying to replicate something inside of a machine. And they'll mostly tell you, well, it has to be slimy, and that, you know, it's like, well, I can't do that. So what you try and do is you try and make stuff that looks like it's doing the thing that you're saying it's doing. The best example of this is the old Mechanical Turk.
The old 1700s so-called machine, I believe.
Yeah, it was a magic trick, right? It was a magic trick, and he'd wheeled this thing in, and the nobility of the day would supposedly be playing a game of chess against this clockwork device that had this little painted puppet of a Turkish gentleman, the torso, and then there'd be this arm that would move the pieces on the board. And the mechanical Turk was quite good. It was very difficult for even chess masters to beat it sometimes. And the whole rollout of the device was very elaborate. You know, it was this big kind of cabinet, and they would open up the sides so you can look inside, and you just see a bunch of clockwork, and so you're like, well, there's not a guy in there. But as we are familiar with stage magicians, just because they show you that there's nothing in there doesn't mean there isn't anything in there. And it was using tricks of perspective and possibly mirrors, I don't know. But they were able to squeeze full-size people into this cabinet, but not have them be evident when they opened up the side. And what they were literally doing was they were contracting with a chess master in the area, and he would squeeze into this machine, and then using mirrors and magnets, and really well made kind of like puppetry arms. The chess master could perceive from the bottom of the board all the pieces on the top of the board, and he could then move his pieces with the puppet arm using mirrors and pulleys and stuff. It was this whole elaborate thing, but it was a wonderful illusion, and it's little things like this which are remembered in amongst computer scientists, if you want to call them, but people that are trying to advance and develop these fields. And it's simply how you. So when you talk about replicating a human mind, the first question that a computer scientist is going to look at is, what is actually relevant? You might look at something like the MP3 compression algorithm, which starts out with the first premise of, well, what portion of the sound wave is actually important? Because, I don't need to have ultrasonic sounds or subsonic sounds in an
it's
MP3.
only like an 11th or something like that of the actual original soundbite that's actually retained or something.
Exactly. Right. So that's the first thing that you do, is you start looking at aspects of the human mind, right? That do I actually need to maintain that at all? I mean, can I just cut that out and maybe replace that with an approximation, a very efficient, calculatively and conceptually approximation. So that's one thing you start to look at. And then the next thing you look at is redundancy in systems, right? So, and again, you look at the MP3 algorithm again. So there are portions of songs that repeat themselves over and over again. And should I have a copy of what the sound was every single time I play that music, or can I algorithmically break down the music, figure out certain components of the music that repeat, copy it once, and then kind of put a placeholder in the music file so that every single time that sound happens, what actually happens is it calls back to that original kind of blip of sound that repeats. And if I do this well enough, you can't tell the difference.
It kind of reminds me, because, I mean, isn't this exactly how YouTube renders videos, for instance?
Absolutely. No, this is fundamental stuff for compression algorithms.
Yeah, because, I mean, people wonder why, YouTube videos, when you have something that's still in a video, and you have it even, playing at like 4K resolution, which I enjoy watching, like, gaming footage on YouTube. The thing is, as long as the image is still, it looks fucking gorgeous in 4K. But even at 4K resolution, you know, you notice that whenever the screen starts to move, and I mean, of course, in a video game, that's usually the case. If you look closely towards the sides of the image, like, it looks like shit. It looks awful. And I believe that's because, you know, the compression is taking advantage of the fact that if you have something that's still in an image, you don't actually have to put any new information there. You can still have that. The problem is you're always going to have some lag, I believe, as the video plays up. But how exactly does this relate to if you want to, so to speak, map a brain or, you know, upload a mind, let's say?
Well, okay, so you start breaking down what it means, the memory structure and the processing structure in the brain. I mean, different ways of doing this, right? Because, you know, this is all, you know, space, you know, super future Star Trekian technology. We don't have anything that does anything like this quite yet. But if you actually started to reverse engineer the memory structure within the neurons of a brain, so you're understanding what's occurring within a given neuron and how that neuron interacts with its nearest neurons, and then how those clusters of neurons interact with you know, the whole brain itself, right? How do I represent that information in the computer? And, you know, the assumption that many people, I think, tend to make is that you would do this literally, right? Like, there would almost be like this spatial map or something, that it would exist. But that in the computer science world, that seems like a really inefficient way to do things. What you would do is you'd say, okay, what variables are relevant in these interactions? Like, because if you're doing like a full spatial map, to us it seems inevitable that there is going to be an enormous amount of unnecessary information in there. I mean, right? You're doing a verbatim copy, and like, does it need to do that? Probably not.
I know. I mean, exactly. I can just give an example here because I believe this is exactly what you're talking about. I mean, let's just take a 3D simulation, you know, or, you know, let's take a video game. You know, even today, you know, when you look at a video game today, it's fucking gorgeous, and you can have like, you know, RTX, for instance, is being promoted by NVIDIA, and you see like all these videos where it's been rendered in real time, and you're like, your mind is like blown at how realistic it looks. But the fact is, what you're looking at, that is supposed to be 3D, and in a way it is 3D, however it's hollow. What you're seeing is a texture, you know? So you're not even rendering anything in 3D truly. What you're doing is you're taking 2D images and you're warping them in space so it appears to be 3D.
Exactly. But it's a great way of looking at it. And when you look at a really excellent video game simulation that has physics and collision and all kinds of material characteristics, like sometimes objects will literally break, right? And there might even be dynamic animations where a material will shatter because of some stress issues on that. But even then, you're not processing, you know, everything down to the atomic level. There's not some sort of chemical analysis. You're not doing. Sandra, you're a chemist by your training here, or at least soon to be, and there's not like an appreciation of the alloys or whatever they're in the metals or the crystalline structures.
Yeah,
this is not my specialty, but you know, but I'm aware of this complexity that exists.
Yeah, let me put it this way.
No one does that.
Let me put it this way. You know, quantum chemists are still trying to accurately simulate a chemical reaction in a computer simulation. And this is something that we've been trying ever since computers were invented, and we're still falling very much behind. We still have to oversimplify like crazy just to get anywhere. And it's kind of funny because what a human being can do in terms of, you know, chemical you know, calculations on a piece of paper, what a chemist can do in 10 minutes will take a supercomputer perhaps, you know, a week to render in one of these softwares. Of course, these softwares are still very useful because, we can visualize things in a way that we couldn't before, and we can also make certain predictions and whatnot. But it still very much is where we foresee something, we try to predict something, and in most cases it still fails miserably in terms of what we actually see in experimental data that we collect. Because, of course, in a science you actually have to test stuff as well. But yeah, no, again, like something so simple, seemingly, but this is what people need to understand. Even if you look at a single molecule, okay, even that we can't render or, simulate properly because of, quantum mechanics and whatnot. Basically, that's like the biggest issue. So if we can't even, simulate something so basic properly as a simple molecule, how would you be able to render a world where you had, in computer terms, like a computer's version of atoms forming, bonds between themselves and forming compounds? It's like you said, like, of course you can't actually do that.
Well, I got the answer. I know exactly how we're going to do it. We're going to cheat. It's what we do. So
I'm starting to notice a theme here, sir.
Yeah, that's what we're going to do. And the thing is, we have to. We don't have a choice. We have to cheat, and we cheat all the time. And the thing is it doesn't matter. Our deception, right, as to what we're doing, doesn't matter if you don't care, right, or even better, if you don't notice. So if you can create a simulation which approximates your standard for success. Not whether I actually did the thing, but whether or not I can pass the test. And that it gets directly to one of the core and original notions of what ultimately constitutes, in the view of computer science. And this is literally how we do it. Whether something passes this test is whether you can't tell. And that is literally the Turing test. So people may have heard the Turing test before, and they asked, or Turing theorized on this issue because the guy was somewhat prophetic and is looking into the future here with this, and he said, look, if I can create something in the computer that you can't tell the difference between this thing and a human being or some other sort of sensate being, then who cares? Now, I appreciate that a lot of people care. I appreciate that they care for all kinds of reasons, but the thing is that within the sphere of computer science, we don't. See, for us, that's mission accomplished. Mm-hmm. The moment you can't tell, we feel we win.
Right. So
and that's it. So for example, let's say I come up with a bunch of interacting expert systems, right? A hierarchy of algorithms that all kind of randomize behavior, analyze information, are cross-referencing all kinds of inferences, right? You're interacting with this thing, and so I've worked really hard to come up with something that gives really human responses to things, and that it has a lot of memory, so you can talk to it many times, and every single time you talk to it, it remembers what you said before, and it's creating a holistic impression of you, itself, the world, all these sort of things. It's processing and remembering, and it's feeding into extremely complicated algorithms, right? You don't see any of that when you're talking to it. What you see is whatever puppet I put in front of you to talk to you, right? So that could be some sort of physical kind of robot head that maybe is beautifully animated. You get artists, legitimate, best you can get artists in there. You get anatomical engineers. Again, if you're doing robotics, and you do this thing, and you lavish extreme attention on this thing, because what you want to try and get past is the goddamn uncanny valley, because the closer you get to the damn thing, the more creeped out everybody gets.
Reminds
me
of Mass Effect Andromeda.
Yeah. Yeah. Which had very bad animations. But yeah, so you put a lot of energy into that. And then there's different little tricks you can do. So one thing you can do is explicitly not try to look human, right? So you could have maybe a cartoon head or like a little emoji face. You know, that's something you see with a lot of robotic AI face representations, is they'll go with like a little smiley emoji face that will animate. And that doesn't creep people out quite as much as like a silicon face with metal bones, you know, underneath the skin, and eyeballs that, you know, move left and right and all that kind of jazz. That sometimes creeps people out. So you do something because you want to put this person at ease. In addition, you want to be able to respond to edge case questions. So this is a concept in programming and other things as well. It's the concept of the edge case, right? So the basic concept is that nearly everything falls within kind of a ho-hum predictable pattern, whatever you're dealing with. But there's like this there's a series of problems that are unusual but completely screw everything up. So, you know, it's like the classic question in a movie when they ask the robot, what is the meaning of love, right? And then it blows smoke out of its ears and explodes. But the robot was fine in every other case. You know, it was moving stuff around, it was responding to questions, it was seeming very human or whatever, right? But it got asked a question it couldn't handle, and so smoke came out of the ears, which is embarrassing. But with the way that robots or like say these chatbots we've all had some experience with, they tend to give unsatisfactory kind of nonsense answers to whenever they get confused or they don't understand the question, or the algorithm is not able to deal with that edge case. And so what you start to do is you start to come up with a series of subroutines and protocols to deal procedurally with every single edge case that you are aware of. And so this is another thing you start to build into your system. Because your primary goal when you're making something like this is not so much to be smart. That's a nice goal if you can do it. But primarily, you want it to not be stupid, and you don't want it to be not obnoxiously stupid. You want it to respond in a way that is acceptable, that doesn't violate the illusion. And so, what I'm more talking about here is AI and maybe artificial life as well. But in regards to uploading a human mind, the thing is that if you were to do that, the way a programmer would look at it is they would start to look at what they felt was the essential, whatever that is. And it would not start with a biochemical breakdown of every atom in your brain. I mean, that might be how the machine reads some information out, maybe, but ultimately how it's going to be represented in the machine is going to be completely different. It's going to be a set of variables that are going to key into these different algorithms as to how you respond to things. And the goal will be that when I fed all this into the system and I turn it on, if your mom can come in and talk to you and she walks away with tears in her eyes saying, oh, you've brought him back to life, it's amazing, then it's like, oh, okay, great, guys, we did it, amazing. That's all they care about. If it turns out that the entire thing is an extremely elaborate charade, from philosophically, from their perspective, that's irrelevant. You know, it's like it's the distinction between having the access code to get into a computer system and just knowing an exploit that just lets you in anyway, right?
Right.
So I know how to hack in. I don't need the password. It's the same thing.
So to summarize, basically, when it comes to mind uploading, probably the best that transhumanists can ever hope for is basically a representation of themselves and not actually themselves.
Sure, and then the question becomes, do you care? Because let me throw this out. This is an additional little mind twist on this, is that what if the person uploading his brain has the same philosophical position as the programmer? What if they agree? What if they say, you know, that approximation of me is good enough?
Mm-hmm.
Now, the guy's still going to get old, going to die, you know, all that sort of stuff, the passing of the flesh. And then this machine goes on after him. And if it goes on about its way and is outwardly indistinguishable from that guy in his behavior, mannerisms, ambitions, beliefs, right? I mean, all the things, if it all just kind of lines up, maybe you don't care. And I appreciate a lot of people do, but maybe the guy that uploaded himself doesn't. And then ask another question: does society care? Right? Mm-hmm. So we are all, our impression of each other is not, you know, deep down at the biochemical all the time. A lot of it is, I hear your voice, I see your face. I am building some sort of an empathic notion about your feelings, right? Like you stub your toe, and I kind of psychosomatically feel my own toe getting stubbed a little bit, and I empathize with your pain. And there's all that kind of stuff, but it's all a supposition in the mind of the observer. And so if you put a whole bunch of these automatons in society that are doing a very good dance, you know, they're given just an absolute rock star performance of being human all the time. Does it matter to society? You know, like if the robot fireman looks like a human being, does all the human stuff, and saves the child, you don't really care. Robot doctor, robot lawyer, whatever. And I'm not suggesting that, like, we replace everybody with robots. That's not the point. The point is that I guess I'm making a defense. I feel obligated to defend the ethical and moral and philosophical premise of my discipline, which holds the belief that if you can't tell, it's as good as the original. Also, that is what we believe. And I'm making an argument, that's what I'm doing, that, you know, we may be right.
Thank you, Sanopi, for taking your time like this, and for you being willing to be recorded for this video. I can tell this segment in particular is going to be very, very good and interesting for people to listen to. Thank you all for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. I hope you enjoyed it. If you want to, I would appreciate it if you subscribed and also clicked that bell just to make sure that you are notified. Also, please follow me on social media. You will find a link to my Twitter, for instance, below. Making these documentaries take a lot of time and effort, and if you decide to donate to me on Patreon, that is very much welcome. If you decide to do that, wow, thank you very much. It really is appreciated. Anyway, I hope you all have a good continuation of your day. Bye!